good afternoon, evening, I guess. I'm going to talk about ecological limits to growth. There's not going to be a lot of ecology in my talk, partly because there isn't a lot of ecology in ecological economics. That's something we can maybe discuss in the panel after I've given my presentation. But I'm largely just going to provide a brief overview of some historical understandings of economic growth, then talk about the kind of neoclassical understanding of growth, and then contrast that with largely an ecological economic understanding of economic growth and the limitations to economic growth. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why we still have an economy which is focused on growth, and a couple of alternative models to that current dominant paradigm of unending economic growth. So as Florian said, it'd probably be best if we keep the questions till the end, just so that we're not interrupting the recording. Okay, now I can make my mouse move. So you'll see lots of hamsters running around wheels in this presentation, largely just because I like hamsters running around wheels, but also because it's a relatively good visual metaphor of our current economic system. So I want to start with a few of these heavy-hitting kind of historical figures in political economy or economics and what they thought about growth. Adam Smith actually surprisingly wrote a lot about this notion of stationarity in The Wealth of Nations. So on the less positive side, he has this quote: "The progressive state," by which he means growing state essentially, "is in reality the cheerful and the hearty state. The stationary is dull and the declining melancholy." So basically, he was a big fan of economic growth. But if you look at through what he writes in The Wealth of Nation, he also kind of claims that economic growth is a temporary normality. It will go on for some time, but it'll have some kind of physical limit. And his understanding was that the physical limit of economic growth was determined by the productive capacity of land, beyond which his argument was that you can accumulate other sorts of capital, but you can't make more profit because you've already maximized the capacity of land. We'll come back to this notion when we talk about ecological economics, because it's actually pretty prescient about the way that ecological economists think about the role of land or kind of natural capital, as opposed to the way that neoclassical economists see this concept. The second person we can talk about and their notion of economic growth is Karl Marx. So Karl Marx had this notion of simple reproduction, and basically the idea was that in a state economy, the state would at some point decide that there was enough stuff to satisfy people's kind of physical needs, and at that point there would be no need for further growth of the economy, and instead you'd switch from producing more stuff to simple reproduction, so just maintaining the stock of goods and services provided by the economy, and focus more on these non-economic goods and services which increase human well-being. This is also not so different from the way people like Herman Daly think about economic growth. We'll come back to this one. There's many quotes I could have provided by John Stuart Mill. So John Stuart Mill, for those who aren't from an economic background, was one of the founding thinkers of utilitarianism, along with Jeremy Bentham. And his argument, well, he had many arguments. He wrote quite explicitly about the problems of economic growth in terms of environmental destruction. But he also made the point that you can't have boundless wealth on a finite planet, and that a stationary condition of capital and population implies no stationary state of human improvement, so you can still improve other forms of utility driven by things like culture, social progress, better morals, these type of issues. And the last and probably the best quote from economic growth. So there was a huge gap between the kind of founding thinkers in economics in the late 18th and early 19th century who did think about this notion of a stationary state. And then when this idea came up again, wasn't until the 1960s with the start of the environmental movement, and people like Kenneth Boulding. So Kenneth Boulding has this famous quote: "Anyone who believes in indefinite growth in anything physical on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist." He was an economist. This was really the start of the critique of this notion that you can have infinite economic growth. And soon after Boulding wrote The Coming Spaceship Earth, we had the work from people like Donna and Meadows and the Club of Rome, who wrote this book in 1972 based on the World 3 model, so a system dynamic model of resource use, population, and human well-being. And they basically made the argument that at some point the physical extraction of resources cannot be sustained at its current growth level, and you'll have this collapse. First, a collapse in services available per capita, then a collapse in population, a collapse in environmental output. And basically these inflection points when they model the economy is likely to collapse start in the sort of 2020s, 2030s, and they would expect to see uncontrollable decline in populations by 2070. This was what their pretty simple model said. There have been some maybe slightly questionable, but I still think interesting attempts to model what's actually been since the 1970s in terms of resource use, services per capita, birth rates, these type of things. So this is from Graham Turner, who's a physicist, in fact, from Australia. And you can see here that some of the resources are tracking quite well with these 1970s. This is a 50-year-old model now. Population, they did quite well. Pollution, they did quite well in. Food per capita, they underestimated. Services per capita, pretty bang on. Birth rates was pretty good. Death rates, they overestimated the death rates. But you can see we're tracking quite well. Well, it's probably not the right word, but quite closely to the model produced 50 years ago by the Club of Rome. And this was really the start of an attempt to question the orthodoxy of neoclassical economics, for which the notion that growth might be problematic simply hadn't occurred. And then we have this last quote. So this is from Robert Solow, who won the Nobel-ish Prize for Economics. There is no Nobel Prize for Economics. And he stated, he walked back this statement, I think in the 1980s, but he had claimed the world can in effect get along without natural resources. So exhaustion, in this case, exhaustion of natural resources, is just an event, not a catastrophe. So as the young people say, what the flip? What the fudge? Why would you possibly believe this? So what I'm going to try and do in the next short section is explain something about the underpinning assumptions which might lead to someone who's obviously smart, like Robert Solow, to come to such a bizarre conclusion, and what an alternative model might be, which provides a slightly more nuanced understanding of the relationship between resources and economic growth. So what do we mean by economic growth? Before I talk about economic growth, I just want to talk a little bit about models, because I think models are super important to science. For me, all science is about models. It's all about the abstraction of complex reality into codified models from which you can explain the world. And it's all about simplifying this complex world we live in such a way that you can understand it. And we can talk about two major sorts of models. We can talk about scientific models, and that there are many sorts of scientific models, but largely you can think of these as being sort of codified knowledge, formalized, simplified representations of real world phenomena, often with linked to some kind of theory or with some kind of ability to predict outcome. So you can think about something like the classical model of supply and demand as being one of these scientific models for explaining states of the world. It explains how much goods we produce based on the market price of those goods and the law of supply and demand. But underpinning those scientific models, we have what are called mental models, and these are kind of implicit and imprecise knowledge, including normative knowledge, that somehow represents people's experiences of the world. So how you know the world in a kind of intangible, sort of implicit way. And you can think about something like this notion of scarcity. So scarcity is a key concept in economics. The whole premise of sort of orthodox economics is that we are beings with seemingly unlimited wants and scarce resources, and we have to find a way of efficiently allocating those resources based on the available resources and the wants that they have to satisfy. And you can even go maybe one step deeper and look at works from people like Joseph Schumpeter. And he talked about this notion of vision, or pre-analytic cognitive act of supplying the raw material. So basically, before you can come up with any of your mental models, you have to have this kind of basic understanding of how the world works. So this idea, I know, of positivism, so that the world is this real tangible thing which you can perfectly know, is a kind of analytical vision which leads to your then kind of mental models and your scientific models. So the whole notion of economic monetism, where you have one model which explains everything, is based on the notion that there's one kind of objective reality that we can know and model. And there are different pre-analytical visions which lead to very different kind of models of the world. So I always like these three quotes, which unfortunately come from three old white men, but I like them nevertheless. When we're talking about models, we want models which are good somehow. So what is a good model? So the first thing we can think about is this notion from Alfred Korbitsky, who was a human geographer. Now, a map is not the territory. So when you're creating a model of the world, you're abstracting from complex reality. And what you include in your model and what you leave out fundamentally shapes your understanding of the world, because it's actually through models that we, to some extent, experience and act in the world. So, for example, when you look at a street map, it doesn't include the color of the doors of every house. It might just include their house numbers. And maybe that's a trivial thing to leave out of a map. It doesn't give you any additional information, but there are things you can not include in your mental models which are highly problematic. Then the next quote I like from George Box, who is a statistician, is all models are wrong and some models are useful. So again, because you're abstracting from complex reality, then you always leave things out. So your models are always incomplete. But some of them can still be useful for thinking about how you act in the world, and some of them aren't. So it's not just whether your model is robust, but whether it provides you useful information about how to act in the world. And the last model, I think this is particularly important for economics, which often is based on simplifications of the world, which are so extreme that they bear no relationship at all to the real world we live in. Everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler, from Einstein. And yeah, I think some of our models are far too simple, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples of those related to growth in a minute. If you're wondering what these pictures are, these are all examples of abstraction of complex reality. We won't go into detail now. You can ask me about them afterwards if you're interested. So now I will get to what we mean by economic growth, or at least what we mean by economic growth from a kind of classical economic perspective, or mainstream economics. So essentially, when people talk about economic growth, they're talking about the increase in production and consumption of goods and services. The assumption is if you produce a good, you consume it. So in other words, the increase in the total amount of economic activity. And it's the total amount of economic activity in terms of goods and services, not money flow. So we're talking about real increases in the amount of goods and services, not inflation in the money supply on the price of goods and services. It's generally measured in terms of gross domestic product. So the market value of all officially recognized final goods and services produced within a country, usually within a period of time, so per year. So we talk about per capita GDP, what is the market value of all the final goods and services produced in an economy in a given year per person. And then these are generally corrected for inflation, so real economic growth, so real GDP, and often in terms of purchasing power parity. So this allows you to compare the economic activity in different countries which have different prices for different goods. So in other words, you figure out a standard basket of economic goods, and you see how much of those are generated in a country. So you can compare between, I don't know, Vietnam and Venezuela, for example. Now we get to the interesting point about economic growth from a kind of neoclassical perspective. And there's these two fundamental models which I think explain why Robert Solow could say we don't need resources in an economy. So the first is called the circular flow model of the economy. It's a pretty simple idea. You have households. Households provide factors of production, labor essentially, to companies. Companies use that labor to produce goods and services. The consumers or households are able to buy those goods and services based on the wages, rents, or dividends they get, so the wages from working, or the rents and dividends if they own the factories. And that consumer spending then goes back to the firms. So this is basically the mental model. And mental here I use in two ways, I guess. It's not really a mental, to some extent, this is a formalized scientific model in economics. It's mental in the sense that it's slightly bonkers. We'll talk about why that might be the case in a minute. But essentially, you have this virtuous circle. So let's assume that consuming goods and services make us happier. Then why wouldn't you want to have a bigger flow of economic activity? There's nothing in that model which should say there's any problems with having more goods and services produced. The second model we can talk about, and this comes from Robert Solow, the Solow-Swan model of growth. This is based on something called the Cobb-Douglas production function. And it essentially says that real growth in GDP, I haven't put the deltas here, but GDP basically is a function of productivity or technology. So that's your how good you are at converting your capital stocks into goods, multiplied by, and in the Douglas-Cobb function, this is actually a multiplication. So it's basically A multiplied by capital stocks K and multiplied by labor stocks or stock of labor L. So in other words, if you want to have economic growth, you have to increase one of these three things. You either have to have higher productivity, better technology for converting capital and labor to goods or services, or you need more capital, or you need more labor. And what's fundamentally problematic about this relationship, this model, is that it implicit in this multiplicative model is that you can substitute different forms of capital, labor, or technology and still get growth in GDP. So in other words, if your productivity doesn't increase, but you have more capital, GDP can grow. If you have the same amount of capital, but more labor, GDP can grow. And this leads us to two fundamental things which are missing. So when they've abstracted from complex reality from a neoclassical perspective, if you look at the circular flow model of the economy, what's fundamentally missing is the environment. There's nothing about where we get the resources in order to produce more goods and services. This is a problem we'll talk about in a minute. And from the Solow-Swan model of economic growth, then it's fundamentally problematic that they make an assumption that capital stocks are substitutable in producing goods and services. And Herman Daly has this nice example, can you build a wooden house without wood? And his argument, and my argument would be, that's a pretty problematic thing to do. But if you look at the Cobb-Douglas production function, well, you just need more labor or more technology. That's a slightly problematic assumption there. So, nevertheless, economic growth is a good thing, right? So something's not right. Our air is clean, our water is pure, we get plenty of exercise, everything we eat is organic, and yet nobody lives past 30. So economic growth has been hugely important for increasing human well-being, directly through increased goods and services, and indirectly through things like infrastructure building, social benefits, healthcare systems, education systems, these type of things. So I'm not here to say that economic growth is implicitly a terrible thing, but there are limits to economic growth. So we can see the bad here. I mean, this is biodiversity loss from the Living Planet Index. You can look at climate change, 1 billion people living in slums. It's now 3 billion people who are affected by water scarcity. More than 50% of the world's land area has been converted to some form of agriculture. 90% of the large fish stocks have been eroded. So economic is good, growth is good up to some point, but at some point it becomes problematic, and we have to think about how we understand when it becomes problematic and why it becomes problematic. And that's what I'll talk about a little bit in the next few slides. So two slightly less problematic mental models, or kind of models from ecological economics, which are alternatives to the circular flow model and the Solow-Swan model. So the first one on the left here, we have basically the ecological economic model of the economy. And fundamentally what ecological economics says is, first, that the economic system is a subsystem of society. So it's shaped and determined by societal actions. It doesn't exist in its own right. It's not something which is kind of a given in a given society. Within that, you can have the circular flow model of the economy, but it has to be based on the fact that society itself is embedded in the environment. So in other words, the economy is a subsystem of society, and society is a subsystem of the environment. Everything which flows into the economy has to come from the environment, and all the waste, which is something which is also missing from the circular flow model of the economy, has to go back into the environment. And the only source of new resources which we have on this planet are incoming solar energy. Everything else is fixed and finite based on the kind of physical products which exist on the planet, or physical entities on our planet. So it's a materially closed system, but open from an energetic perspective. So this is a key point to remember. The Earth is a subsystem of the economy is a subsystem of the environment. And the second model, which maybe is a bit too small for you to read, is a kind of alternative to the Douglas or the Cobb-Douglas production function. And this is basically, again, it comes from Herman Daly, but this is Donna and Meadows' work on indicators talking about this. And he has something called the means end spectrum. And his argument basically here is that we have ultimate means, which are essentially natural capital. So that's biosphere, earth materials, biochemical cycles, and incoming solar energy. And then we have ultimate ends, which you can define in different ways, but we might say well-being or fulfillment or self-realization, enlightenment. And then between that, we have intermediate means and intermediate ends. And essentially, those intermediate means are the ways that you transform natural capital into those ultimate ends that you desire. So in other words, all forms of human capital from an ecological economic perspective aren't simply substitutable with each other in order to produce goods and services, but rather they are the human capital is a means by which you can transform natural capital into things which provide ultimate human well-being. And that's fundamentally different than the neoclassical model, because it requires you to understand that what limits our ability to reach our ultimate ends is fundamentally the stock of natural capital which we're dependent on. And so this brings us to a second important distinction that exists in ecological economics, and that is the notion that the economy is not just should not be just measured in terms of the flow of goods and services, but the economy actually has a physical side. There's a physical, everything which comes into the economy flows into the economy, and everything which goes out of the economy flows out of, as waste flows out of the economy back into the environment. And you can physically measure those flows, so that there's a biophysical size to the economy. I guess most of you are probably aware of things like the ecological footprint. It's an imperfect indicator of the size of the economy, but it tells you something about the theoretical land required for our consumption. More strictly, I think in ecological economics, there's this notion of material and energy throughput. So this is the physical amount of materials flowing through the economy. And the those are the things which are transformed into goods and services and thrown back into the ecosystem as a waste. So maybe even more important is to think of the economy as a kind of metabolizing subsystem of the environment. So this is my now wonderful PowerPoint skills here. So we have, you can think of the economy as a living being, in this case, this gentleman here, and that gentleman takes in resources, yum, 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 but then it spits out waste, and that waste produces problems. So we can think in terms of extracting resources from the environment, at least a biodiversity loss, resource depletion, loss of ecosystem services, environmental degradation, and the pollution from the waste from economic activity leads to things like climate change, persistent organic pollutants causing health effects, more biodiversity loss, other forms of pollution, microplastics, all this type of stuff. And this isn't just a problem at the global scale. So this is a problem which might occur at much finer scales. Again, we can think about this notion of uneconomic growth. So the point at which the marginal utility, the amount of additional benefit you get from producing one more good or service exceeds the amount of disutility, the amount of harm you're doing in terms of the supporting kind of ecological services or environmental services from producing that good or service. So this is called the economic limit. And beyond that, you have this disutility exceeding utility. This is problematic for a number of reasons. One is that I can still increase my utility at the expense of someone else. So maybe after this, I haven't put any slides in this talk, but we can talk about things like ecologically unequal exchange and why this is problematic, that essentially the growth in the kind of majority world is at the expense of the well-being of people in the minority world. But it's not just this isn't a problem which occurs only at the global scale. So you can have disutility in one place and increased utility in the other place. And this is largely argue what's happened in the last 30 or 40 years in our global economy. So fundamentally, we have this notion of economic growth digging its own grave. So it's destroying the system in which it's embedded, and without the ability to continue to extract those ecological resources from the environment, the economy cannot be maintained. So this is a relatively old figure now, but I couldn't find a newer one. This is something called GPI, the Genuine Progress Indicator, which is an alternative to GDP, which tries to take into account things like defensive spending. So that, in other words, in our current system, when you look at GDP, if you have an oil spill, which pollutes 10,000 kilometers of coastland, then all the money which is spent to clean up that oil spill adds to GDP. This is economic activity, and it counts as a positive number on your accounting of the economic activity for humans. And I think it's pretty clear that you can argue that not having that oil spill in the first place would have been a better outcome than having an oil spill and then spending money trying to clean some of it up. So GPI, the Genuine Progress Indicator, tries to extract that defensive spending, so spending on things like environmental remediation, but it also includes things like, well, can we really include the money we spend putting people in jail as a positive contribution to human well-being? Probably not. So it takes away all these defensive spending, and when you look at that, GDP growth has been steadily increasing over the last 50 years, but Genuine Progress Indicator, so the economic activity which actually produces goods and services which people benefit from, is somehow flatlined over those last 50 years. So we have a pretty clear idea that economic growth is problematic theoretically, problematic in terms of human well-being. So why do we keep shoveling fuel into the runaway train? This is a title from a book by Brian Check on steady-state economics, which I highly recommend. He's a very interesting guy. He works for the American Wildlife Department, and I'm not sure how he coped with 4 years under Trump, but that's something else. So just to give you some idea of economic growth, then this is a nice paper, or I think it's actually a book by Graham Clark, who tried to estimate income per person with the year 1800 as a baseline. So one between 1000 BC and the year 2000, and essentially you had this pretty standard amount of income per person until the Industrial Revolution. Then you had what he calls a Great Divergence, and this massive exponential growth in the size of the economy, just overwhelming growth in a very short period of time. And exponential growth is in itself problematic. I'm not going to talk about it in detail. I don't know, maybe some of you have heard of this kind of thought experiment before about the amoeba. So imagine that you have a test tube with food in it and one amoeba which splits every minute. And you put the amoeba into the test tube at 1 minute past midnight, and you know at midnight the next day the test tube will be full. 1 minute before midnight, the test tube is only half full. 5 minutes before midnight, the test tube is only 5% full. So it's very difficult when we reach these ecological limits to growth to kind of conceptualize them until you get very close to them. And exponential growth is quite a hard concept for many humans to grasp. So that's one of the problems of why we have these existing growth dynamics, but there are other things we can talk about. So one of the main ones, and this is something, well, many people have talked about this. Maynard Keynes talked about this, for example, a great deal, but we can talk about the technological treadmill. So this is the idea that we have an economic system which is premised on productivity. So again, this A in the Douglas Cobb-Douglas production function, And if we're able to increase labor productivity, it means we can produce more goods and services, but now we have less people to buy them. So our number of households, or capacity of households to buy those goods and services decrease. So now we have to produce more goods and services in order to give people jobs so they can buy the stuff that we're making in the economy. So there's a nice quote from Peter Victor. The shortage of employment has become more important than the shortage of goods and services. Whereas in the past, we needed to have more people at work because we needed goods and services they produce. Now we have to increase production simply to keep people employed. So, I mean, the classic example, you can see this clearly if you look at advertising. So in the 1950s, if you looked at the way people advertised fridges, it was, this is a fridge, it will keep your milk cold, buy one. And then people bought one and everyone had a fridge and that was good. But now you needed more people to buy more fridges, even though they all had one. So by now the adverts is, this is a fridge, it will make you successful and handsome. And the clearest example I see of this, so I don't have a television, so I don't get to see many adverts, thankfully, but I occasionally go to the cinema and I see these adverts for cars where it's a car driving across a desert which turns into a snake and then a scorpion, then it pulls up outside a fancy house and there's inevitably a beautiful woman with a glass of champagne. I'm thinking, what do I know about this car? That it's going to turn into a snake and I'm going to be married to a beautiful woman with champagne? It's just... So we have an economy now which isn't actually about increasing well-being by increasing goods and services, but it's about increasing employment in order to buy the goods and services we produce, and that's fundamentally problematic and not a trivial problem to solve. The next problem, again, and this is also related to economic efficiency, is the rebound effect. So this is essentially the idea, and this comes from Stanley Jevons originally. He was writing about the coal question in the 19th century, and he was basically saying to himself, okay, in the last 30 years of the Industrial Revolution, we've become much more efficient at using coal. So our steam engines are much more efficient than they used to be. So we should be using less of this resource, right? So efficiency is the key notion in neoclassical economics, efficient allocation of scarce resources. But if you use a resource more efficiently, then you lower the costs and that increases demand, and the aggregate amount of resources might actually increase. And you can see this either from a direct rebound effect. So here is an example. You increase the fuel efficiency of your cars. That means they cost less, so you drive more often, or from the indirect rebound effect. So this is you increase the fuel efficiency of your car, it lowers your petrol bills, and then you use the money you save to fly to Greece, and the impact on the environment remains the same. So this is another fundamental challenge of an economy which is premised on efficiency, is that efficiency has no notion of scale, and being more efficient can actually just increase demand. Then we can talk about money as debt. I won't go into too much detail about this, but essentially 90% of the money in supply is created as debt by private banks. And the problem with that is when you borrow money from a bank, you only borrow the principal of the loan. So you borrow €1,000 and then you have to pay back €1,000 plus the interest on that loan. I know, so €200 over 10 years or something. And that means there's not enough money in the system to pay off both the principal of debt and the interest on the debt, which means you have to create more money in order to service those debts. If you stop creating more money, then the system collapses. And this is problematic because fundamentally, money is a demand on the environment to do work. If I have money in my pocket, I can give it to someone and I expect goods and services for it. So the more money you have in the system, the more demand you can put on the environment to extract resources and provide you goods and services. And then maybe even the most fundamental issue is growth as a social goal. So GDP growth remains the dominant policy goal of almost every nation in the world. So we have a policy which is focused not on human well-being, but GDP growth. And we have indicators of progress linked to GDP, not to environmental well-being. Nice quote here again by Herman Daly. Even if we can never quantify happiness as precisely as we can quantify GDP, perhaps it's better to be vaguely right than precisely wrong. One of the points I would make here is that economics as a field of science has been largely driven by the works of people like Vilfredo Pareto and Stanley Jevons to be seen as this objective science of quantifying things in a mathematical formula. So before economics was economics, it was called political economy, and it was seen as a normative field of politics, essentially, where you talked about what the right thing to do was and how you increase human well-being. But there was this kind of physics envy by these 19th century economists who wanted to say, you know, we can objectively measure well-being, we can objectively measure utility, and so they wanted the icks that you get from physics, and economics became economics, and they lost the sight of the fact that our models shouldn't define what our goals are. Our goals should define what our models are, and we've lost that relationship, and that's also highly problematic. You can see why this is potentially problematic. You can see many of these figures if you look through the literature, but these are two graphs here. Again, they're showing GDP per capita in terms of PPP, purchasing power parity, with life expectancy at birth on this axis here, and social progress indicator on this one. And you can see you have these kind of asymptotic curves where when you're poor, increasing your income, and this is at the national level, so it doesn't deal with any of the kind of inequality within nations, but still at the national level, small increases in income lead to big increases in life expectancy or kind of social progress, however you might measure that. But beyond some sort of cutoff point, these relations flatline. So you can have a life expectancy of 80 and an income of $8,000 per year, or you can have an income of $45,000 a year and have exactly the same life expectancy. So all the economic growth beyond this kind of point here isn't really leading to increases in the subjective things that we might actually care about, or not as big as we might expect. I mean, and this is a classically understood notion in economics. So declining marginal utility and consumption. Your first pairs of shoes make you pretty happy. You keep your feet dry. You don't stand on things which cut your feet. Your 27th pair of shoes doesn't provide quite as much happiness for you, right? So this is something we ought to know again. But we still have this, even in highly industrialized, wealthy nations in the majority world, this focus on GDP growth, despite the fact that it isn't any longer particularly closely linked to anything that we might care about. One thing to note here is the GDP per capita in 2017 was $17,000. So if all the economic activity was equally spread around the world, then all the people would be somewhere around here, and probably we'd be able to more or less maximize life expectancy, subjective well-being, social progress. So it's more a question of distribution than more production. And that leads to, I think, probably my last slide on these things, which is that economic growth has been an excuse for inequality. So this quote by Henry Vallish, who was a economic advisor to Kennedy, said, growth is a substitute for inequality of income. So long as there is growth, there is hope. That makes large income differentials tolerable. In other words, we live in a hugely unequal world, but as long as everyone's getting richer, all the boats are floating, then people are willing to put up with that inequality. And you can see this in the real world. But this relation should hold the other way around. So if growth is a substitute for equality, then greater equality is also a substitute for growth. So redistribution might be a way of increasing well-being without expanding the human niche at the expense of these environmental goods and services, which we're fundamentally dependent on. I've talked about that, so I don't need to show that slide. And then the last point is this notion of growth or collapse. So because of all these dynamics I've talked about, technological unemployment, money as debt, our social goals being growth, excuse for inequality, we have an economic system which is where economic growth is functional for economic stability. In other words, if you stop the economy growing, it doesn't stabilize, it potentially collapses. And this is a problem because it means collapse is today's problem due to stability, and environmental degradation is tomorrow's problem, or at least it's been tomorrow's problem up till now. So we focus on these short-term problems of maintaining economic growth in order to maintain employment and stop the system collapsing, but they're building up more and more pressure in terms of ecological damage, which we maybe can't reverse later. You can see this also maybe again in the discussion. We can talk about things like panicky and resilience thinking. So essentially we're putting lots of energy in maintaining a system which fundamentally will collapse at some point. And rather than allowing small collapses and reorganization, so rethinking about what our goals are, rethinking the notion of efficiency, rethinking the notion of distribution, we try and maintain the current system. At some point, there might be a large ecological collapse, which we can't recover from. So that's something we want to avoid if we can. So unlike Solo's notion that exhaustion is just an event, I would argue it is in fact a potential catastrophe which should be avoided. So that leads questions which I'm not going to go into detail here about whether we can have incremental change to a system dynamic, or you have to break the system in a revolutionary way and start with something new. But largely we have this situation, we have kind of inequality, rebound effects, wrong mental models, technological employment, money is debt, and growth-focused policies, all pushing our hamster wheel to grow further at the expense of our environment. So how do we stop the hamster wheel spinning? How am I doing for time? Okay, so I will be relatively quick. So now we have, this isn't a dead hamster. This is my attempt to make a resting hamster. So it's sleeping. It's perfectly happy. And I'm going to talk just very briefly about two approaches to economic growth. The first is steady state economics, and the second is degrowth. So I always like this lovely cartoon that from the Dgrowth conference, more of the same of the same, less of the same, or something simply different. It's something simply different that we need. So we can't simply have the current economic system stop growing and expect everything to be good. We need to create alternative economic models. So the first thing I think we need to do, and this is this wonderful quote from Henry George, who wrote this book, Poverty and Progress, in 1879, the second best-selling book in America that year. Only the Bible sold more copies. That doesn't happen with economic books anymore. It's a well-provisioned ship, this which we sail through space. If bread and beef above deck seem to grow scarce, we but open a hatch and there is a new supply of which before we never dreamt. And the very great command over the services of her comes to those who as the hatches are opened are permitted to say, this is mine. He's critiquing kind of colonialism here, basically. But you have to understand that when people were creating these mental models of the world, which didn't include the environment, it was at the time where, and these were largely kind of European or even British scholars, the world seemed like an endless place. We were discovering new lands and pillaging them for all their resources, which of course we didn't get to see that harm we were causing by doing that. But the notion that we lived in a full world was simply alien to people like John Stuart Mill, but it's not alien to us anymore. So we have to take this kind of mental mind shift from a frontier world of boundless possibilities to one where our size of our economy is larger than the ecological system needed to support it. And so this is largely the work of Herman Daly to kind of make this argument. And one of the key arguments that Herman Daly makes is that even proper functioning markets, if you can have proper functioning markets, although they can allocate resources efficiency, there is no notion of sustainable scale within the market. It's all about individuals trying to maximize their well-being, and they can't provide some notion of what sustainable scale is. So that needs government policy. So any of the kind of notions of fixing the size of the economy within the size of the environment come from steady state economics are largely based on top-down understandings that we can't rely on the market. So people like Herman Daly don't have problems with market economies, but market economies have to be constrained in such a way. So you can have efficient allocation of resources, but within a societally deemed maximum amount of resources which you can use in a sustainable manner. So when Herman Daly talks about a steady state economy, then he's talking about a concept with a kind of two physical characteristics. So you have a stock of capital, and capital in Daly's understanding is artifacts, so that's buildings, people, cars, infrastructure, roads, these type of things, and then a physical flow of throughput which is required to maintain that stock of capital. So you have to have an economy where the material throughput is such that there is sufficient resources to maintain that throughput in the long run. So in other words, you want the minimum amount of material and energy throughput in your economy, and you want to maximize the amount of resources in the economy for that given material and energy throughput. And this is an argument which is kind of somehow counter to some of the recent thinking about things like circular economy. So from an ecological economic perspective, it's impossible to have a circular economy. There always has to be material and energy flows, just from the laws of entropy. So when Herman Daly talks about the steady state economy, he's talking about an economy which has a constant stock of people and artifacts maintained at some desirable low level of throughput. And he has three pretty simple rules for doing this. So renewable resources, such as fish stocks, should be used no faster than the rate at which they regenerate. Non-renewable resources, such as minerals and fossil fuels, should be used no faster than you can replace them for. This is a problem with things like non-renewable resources like oil or steel. You can't say we can't use them at all, but you only want to use them at the rate at which you can find some substitute. So it's okay to burn fossil fuels as long as you're using that, ignoring the climate change issue, but that comes in point 3. As long as you're using that energy you generate from that non-renewable source to invest in new sources of energy, solar panels, wind turbines, these type of things. And the third rule is pollution and waste must be emitted no faster than the natural system can absorb them, recycle them, or render them harmless. So that takes into account both the flows into the economy and the flows out of the economy, completely missing from neoclassical economic thinking. So when we think about how we might create a more steady state economy, this comes from CASI, the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. There's a link to their website, which is a really good resource if you're interested in these things. So they talk about limiting resource use, so putting physical caps on resources. Within those, you can then have things like cap and trade schemes where you allocate them efficiently in the marketplace, stabilize human populations, reduce inequality, reduce working hours, reform the monetary system to get rid of debt money essentially, and change how we measure progress. There's another wonderful book by Tim Jackson. So this was from a commission developed by the British government, and he wrote a report called Prosperity Without Growth, at which point the commission was immediately disbanded by the British government, but it's published as a book, so you can read it. And he talks about establishing a vision of prosperity, investment in ecological resources, investment in jobs and infrastructure, strengthening social capital, and then the easy one, dismantling the culture of consumerism. So this is something which, yeah, that's a pretty trivial thing to do, right? We can manage that one. And the second thing, and I'm going to talk about this even more briefly because it's such a big topic and it's such a diverse field that it's very difficult to do any justice in kind of a talk which isn't fundamentally about degrowth. So degrowth differs from steady state economics in the sense that it doesn't start with this premise that we have in a market economy which has a certain way of functioning and we have to constrain it from kind of top-down actions in terms of resource management, but rather it thinks about this more bottom-up understanding of how we refine our notion of progress, so how we create our models of what a good life is, for example. It has notions, things like care, conviviality, post-industrialism, simplicity. Now, this is the kind of a classical definition, an equitable downscaling of production and consumption that increases human well-being and enhances ecological conditions in the short and long term. I think what's important about degrowth in comparison to steady state economics is it's really trying to fundamentally challenge the paradigms of our economic system, change our values, reaffirm kind of social and ecological goals, and repoliticize this notion of the economy. So the economy isn't just a objective observation of the real world, but our economic thinking is actually driving our patterns of consumption and production, and we need to challenge those. It's particularly based on in the majority world that stabilizing the economy, so having a steady state economy isn't enough. We actually have already reached ecological overshoot and we need to reduce our consumption. And so it's often linked to this notion of contraction and convergent, which came from climate economics, basically, that not all nations should degrow. It's one of the classical arguments. Well, Are you telling people in Nigeria that they can't grow their economy? No, that's not what we're saying at all. It's as much a political and social movement as it is an economic concept. So whereas steady state economics is largely premised around kind of theoretical understandings of ideal economies, there's a lot of more action focused research in degrowth about creating new imaginaries and kind of local experiments for different ways of living. And one of the important things which it does, which you don't see in steady state economics, it focuses not just on managing supply, which is Daly's approach, but really managing demand. So figuring out ways of reducing this notion that humans have unlimited wants, which I don't think we actually have. And partly that acknowledges the rebound effect, and so it kind of tries to address efficiency as a solution by saying, okay, we can be more efficient as long as we say, good, you can produce more stuff, but I don't want a second fridge, and I don't want a car which turns into a snake so that I can drive through the desert, which I don't want that. Degrowth is a relatively young field of study. So the first conference was in Paris in 2008. It's still somewhat vague in terms of its theoretical perspectives, partly because it's pluralistic, and that's a positive thing, I would argue. And it does have a lot of kind of different antecedents. So, you know, from the kind of physical understanding of the economy from people like Georgescu Rogan to these kind of Buddhist thinking of small is beautiful, and also these kind of radical deindustrialization thinking from things like a blueprint for survival, and notions of voluntary simplification and kind of non-violence as well, I think, which are super interesting in terms of really who thought about that you can have economic thinking which is based on non-violence, where how do you build that into our existing models? So that's more or less all I had to say. Just to summarize, so neoclassical economic models of the relationship between human well-being and the environment are very poor, and we need better ones. And I think pluralistic economics, but not just ecological economics, is a key source of shifting from this dangerous growth paradigm. Ecological economics is largely focused on some of these biophysical issues. It doesn't deal so well with some of the more social issues like justice and power, and there are other fields of economic thinking, feminist economics, for example, which might be much better at addressing some of those problems.